Welcome, Martin. Thank you for joining us and thank you for talking about climate negotiations with our learners. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background and how did you get involved with the climate change field?
I'm a lawyer by training and I was a German diplomat for many years. And in 2007, the Maldives introduced in the Human Rights Council the first resolution on human rights and climate change. And at that time, climate change was not about human beings. The iconic picture was the little iceberg on a piece of ice that is melting. But it was really the Maldives resolution, which I negotiated on behalf of the European Union at the time, that opened my eyes and said, well, basically, this is about human beings. And ever since I learned about climate change, it became something that I feel passionate about. And so after that, half a year later, I quit working with the German diplomatic service. I joined at the time Kofi Annan, and I helped in his forum to frame his work around the issues that are still with us, which are the human face of climate change and climate justice. And it gives me some satisfaction to see how these principles, how this approach to look at climate change from a human perspective have really become mainstream in the last 11 years.
Great story. And what is something that you would say most people don't know about climate change negotiations? Is there any secret, anything inspiring that happens that people are not really aware of but should?
Well, I think it's two things. I think we still have a long way to go to make really people understand how vitally important these negotiations are for their very personal future. It is really about all of us. And the thing is, like in any negotiation, you can only go as far as a negotiator as your population and your government is supporting you. So climate change, and we see that happening now, really needs to become a popular demand. It needs to become something that decides on whether you win or lose the elections if you run for office. And despite the impacts of climate change being so visible and so clear, I'm still somehow missing this big popular pressure on decision makers to really take strong action for the sake of ourselves, but also for the sake of our children.
How does it work for you when you talk to maybe your friends or relatives or people in your circles that's not people from work? How does it go, a conversation when you discuss climate change?
Well, it's interesting because I usually say yes to any possibility to speak about climate change. So I'm speaking to people in a place for elderly people, I'm speaking to students, I'm speaking to children, I'm speaking to everybody. And once you basically have spoken 5-10 minutes about the climate negotiations, the first question I always get is, now between us, is that real? And I say, yes, well, it is very real. Look at the River Rhine if you work in Bonn, as I do, which never had as little water as currently. Look at the California wildfires. Look at the sequence of tropical storms that was never there before. But still, I think there's a very human thing to deny what is right in front of your eyes. Because if you think about it, it's actually very bad. And people don't want to hear very bad news. So we're always focusing on the good news, saying, well, there's still something you can do about it, and we can solve that together. And I strongly believe that, because if we are ever to fulfill the SDGs, it will only work if we fight climate change. And actually fighting climate change is maybe the biggest chance to actually get sustainable development that we ever had. Bill Clinton said climate change is the biggest business opportunity since the end of Second World War. But this is not trickling down, and it needs so many more people speaking about that. We are living in a world that is a post-fact world, and all sorts of nonsense makes it to the social media. And if you look at statistics, what people tell you, the one thing people believe is actually their friends, their relatives, their families. So what we need is hundreds of millions of climate ambassadors talking to their friends, to their peers, to their parents, to their grandparents, and telling them it's real and we need to do something about it. And maybe, and that could be the beauty of it, it is something that can actually bring people together, as common enemies do bring people together.
Have you had an experience where you changed somebody's mind about the importance and the urgency of climate change? Can you tell me a story?
I had another experience where I thought, oh gosh, now I have to change somebody's mind. I was sitting down in a restaurant and all places were taken, so I was sitting with a man maybe 10 years older than I am, and the conversation started, and unavoidably he asked me, so what are you doing? And internally I was rolling my eyes thinking, now if I say climate change, then I'm in another heated debate when I just wanted to have a quiet lunch. And so I said, well, I'm working against climate change. And he looked at me and said, well, you don't need to convince me because I know it's real. And I was surprised and said, so how would you know? And he says, well, I'm a hobby beekeeper since I'm 15 years old. And I keep track every single year about my bees. And I see it so clearly that spring comes earlier, that it's shorter, that every winter now I have to give additional food to my bees because otherwise they wouldn't survive winter. And that gave me also hope because here was somebody who just experienced it and made the conclusion. What I'm seeing here is not a coincidence, but it's a part of a bigger thing that actually is affecting all of us.
That's a great example about a personal story. What is your view about the global climate action? What is happening currently, and what do you think lies ahead?
What I currently see is an incredibly interesting situation because some of the things that were triggered by the fight against climate change can actually bring change in society like very few things. I think it's an exciting time for entrepreneurs, it's an exciting time for young people, and it's actually a time for big dreams. Because the basic question we have to ask ourselves is, what's the good life? How do we want to have a good life? Now, if I'm telling you for climate change, for example, well, it would be good if we would stop combusting engine vehicles in inner cities immediately. Well, that has also side benefits. It would be so much quieter in the inner city. You would be able to breathe the air again. You would have less children with asthma. The food that's laying outside for display wouldn't be polluted by the cars passing by. That's really interesting. I would buy into that even if it wouldn't be for climate change. So energy, for example, renewable energy, once you put solar panels on your roof, that costs a lot of money. But as we know now, they will continue to produce electricity for 30, 40, 50 years for free. So that sounds good, doesn't it? Electricity for free, a lifetime, water that you can actually drink, biodiversity which stops being decimated at an incredible rate. These are really attractive things. So what I'm trying to say is that doing the right things for climate change could actually make all of our lives a lot more agreeable, pleasant, and even maybe more fulfilled.
What are some of the challenges ahead of us, and what are some of the big barriers preventing us from achieving global climate action? You mentioned a little bit about public response, public awareness, and action. What about the role of organizations and intergovernmental processes as well? If you could comment.
Yeah, it's a big process of give and take. The image I'm using is 10,000 people need to jump over a trench, but it only works if everybody jumps at the same time, otherwise we are falling down. And I think the biggest challenge is trust and confidence, because in international negotiations, like unfortunately ever so often in human behavior, you would do something if you would trust the other person, and in return the other person would do something if this person would trust you. So if we establish a common trust that we are all in this together, and that in my image we need to jump together, then we would achieve a lot. Because again, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not about winners and losers. It's actually about taking a step as mankind to overcome the biggest challenge that we maybe ever had. And here is the flip side of it. If we manage to do that, I think international cooperation will and necessarily has to be on a higher level than before. It's a completely solvable problem, but it is something that needs what we sometimes call radical cooperation. So my boss, Patricia Espinosa, she calls that inclusive multilateralism, and I quite like the term, because it's not only multilateralism in the sense that countries need to work together. It's actually a way of multilateralism in which you need NGOs, academia, all sorts of organizations, cities, state, enterprises. Everybody can contribute to what is being needed, and it's an unprecedented thing. In your course, you also speak about climate action, and interweaving the actions taken by countries, the activities undertaken from everybody, from young entrepreneurs to a big NGO, all do matter, and the one is supporting the other. And if we get this right, we are not on a downward spiral anymore, but on an upward spiral, which is actually a little bit also the system of the Paris Agreement. Because when you present your NDCs, your nationally determined contributions, 5 years later, you present the next set, they have to be better and more ambitious than the previous one. And that can only be done if you really reach out to everybody in society.
Have an inclusive process.
Absolutely.
And one more thing, I'm sure people are curious about what is the day of a negotiator like? What are some of the practicalities about negotiating?
Well, the first thing is you wake up in the morning way too early, and you had way too little sleep because you worked very, very long the night before. So the first thing is actually that you coordinate as a national negotiator with your negotiation group, that might be the G77 or the European Union, and you try to find amongst your peer a common position. And then you enter in the conference room, depending on what your technical specialization is, and you try with like-minded people to get your position somehow true. And then on the other hand, you need to listen to what other people want to get as their positions. You need to find out what are the negotiation bargaining chips, what are actual red lines. And then if you're a good negotiator, you spend a lot of time having informal talks, coffees, lunches with people, really building this personal network of trust to find out so what is just a facade and what is really a negotiating item. And in the end, if you manage to have this group of people who trust each other, almost every time you can find a common ground and build something as an agreement. And that actually is well worth the many nights that you didn't sleep, because it's a wonderful feeling if you actually manage to get an agreement with 197 parties. You know how difficult it is to get an agreement even in one family, and to get an agreement amongst 7 billion people is remarkable. And there's nothing like these moments when it actually works and the gavel comes down and the whole room explodes in joy. So that makes it worthwhile.
You've seen the picture of the Paris Agreement being adopted.
Absolutely, I was there.
Is there anything else you would like to say to the learners of Climate Change course?
Well, what I would like to say, it's just simply, it's about you. And there is always something you can do. My pet example, and I was the climate change director at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, but it's not only because of that. One of the most important decisions is actually what you eat, what you buy for food, and how little food you are able to, let me do that again. The one thing which I think is really important for everybody is we are all in this together, and it takes every single individual action. And that's not only looking at the election platforms and asking your delegates questions, your members of parliament's questions, what you do about climate change. It's also your personal actions. Food, for example, it really matters what you buy, not only for the planet, but also for your individual health. So there's always every day a little bit you can do, and if many people do a little bit, we make a big step together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.